Hey everyone, Noir here. Let's get into today's Reddit story.
My parents bought my older brother a house and proudly told everyone he had won at life, while I stood there pretending it did not sting. Years later, that same brother stared at my beachfront home in disbelief and asked how I could possibly afford it. What nobody in my family knew was that I had been quietly building something far bigger than they ever imagined. When the truth finally came out, the room went completely silent. My parents did not just help my older brother buy a home. They did not make a down payment, co-sign a loan, or pitch in a little money. They paid for the entire thing. It was a 3-bedroom house with 2.5 bathrooms in a quiet neighborhood, with a cul-de-sac and one of those mailboxes shaped like a tiny barn. They even hosted a family dinner to announce it, almost like they were revealing a pregnancy. My mom got emotional, wiped away tears, and said, "We just wanted to give Preston the best possible start in life. Preston is 2 years older than I am. He has always been the kind of guy people notice the moment he walks into a room. He is loud, outgoing, and naturally charming. Somehow he makes every gathering feel more exciting just by showing up. I am not saying that because I resent him. That is honestly just his personality. Ever since we were kids, my parents seemed drawn to that energy the same way people gather around a warm campfire. When Preston brought home average report cards, everyone praised him. When I earned better grades, I usually got nothing more than a quick nod. After college, Preston landed a sales job, and my parents celebrated like he had won an award. Around the same time, I started working in information technology project management, earning about the same salary, but nobody threw a party because I managed successful infrastructure projects. Everything changed when Preston was 29 and I was 27. One Sunday, my parents gathered the whole family around the dinner table. Preston and I were there, along with Aunt Beverly, a few cousins, and several relatives. My dad stood up like he was about to give a wedding toast. He rested one hand on Preston's shoulder and proudly announced that they had spent years saving money because they wanted to invest in Preston's future. He actually emphasized the word invest, as if he had practiced saying it beforehand. The house cost $320,000. Dad announced the price with obvious pride. My mom was already crying before he even finished speaking. Everyone around the table applauded. Aunt Beverly lifted her glass in celebration, and my cousin Caleb laughed before saying Preston had officially won at life. Preston smiled, acted humble, and shrugged it off, but it was obvious he loved every second of the attention. Then he leaned toward me and quietly whispered, "Can you believe this?" He said it like we were sharing the moment together. I smiled back and said, "Congratulations, man." And I genuinely meant it, mostly. I was never expecting my parents to buy me a house too. That was never the issue. What bothered me was the way they presented everything. They never said they simply wanted to help Preston. Instead, they acted as though he had earned this incredible reward through sheer success, as if the rest of us had been standing on the sidelines, collecting participation trophies while he conquered the world. Preston worked in sales for a packaging supply company. He did all right. Most of the time, he kept his quarterly numbers to himself, and he drove a company vehicle. Calling him some extraordinary success story felt like a huge stretch. After dinner, I stayed behind to help my mom wash the dishes. She was still glowing with excitement over Preston's new house. I told her I was happy for him, and I truly was. Then, I casually mentioned that I had been looking at buying a property myself. It was an older duplex, about 20 minutes outside the city. The building needed some cosmetic work, but the price was reasonable, and one side already had a tenant paying $900 each month. She paused while rinsing a glass. "A duplex?" she asked. "You mean, like a rental property?" "Yeah," I answered. 2 units. I would live in one and rent the other. The rent would cover most of my mortgage. She tilted her head with a puzzled expression. "So that is what young people are doing these days?" Later that evening, I found my dad putting folding chairs away in the garage. I explained the same plan to him. He looked at me for a moment, clearly choosing his words. "That sounds practical," he finally said. Then he added, "Just be careful. Managing tenants can get complicated. Do not get in over your head. It is harder than people think. He sounded supportive enough, but I understood the message underneath his words. Preston received applause. I received a warning. None of that changed my mind. I bought the duplex anyway. I closed on it that October for $185,000. Over the next 3 weekends, I renovated the empty unit by myself. I painted every room, replaced the kitchen faucet, scrubbed the carpets until they looked new, and handled every small repair I could. By December, I had found another tenant willing to pay $950 a month. Both units were occupied. Both tenants always paid on time. After collecting the rental income, my own share of the mortgage came to just $340 each month. When Thanksgiving arrived later that year, Preston's new house dominated nearly every conversation. My mom had framed a picture of him standing proudly on the front porch, holding his keys. She actually displayed it on the fireplace mantel, right beside a portrait of my late grandmother, as if Preston's home purchase had become part of our family's history. Before dinner, she proudly walked Aunt Beverly through every detail of the house like she was a real estate agent. 3 bedrooms, granite countertops, a backyard with a patio. And over she repeated how wonderful the neighborhood was. Once everyone finally sat down to eat, I think it was Caleb's wife who asked how my place was coming along. The conversation softened just enough that I noticed it. It was not complete silence, just that slight drop in volume people make when they are curious, but not especially invested. I told them everything was going well. Both tenants had been reliable. The property was in good condition. I mentioned replacing the kitchen faucet myself and explained that I was planning to upgrade the water heater next. My mom simply smiled. The way she smiled reminded me of how adults smile at a little kid who proudly shows them a drawing that barely looks like what it is supposed to be. "That's cute, Nolan," she said. "Our little landlord." A few people laughed. It was not cruel laughter. It was more like the reaction someone gets for ordering a salad at a steakhouse. Not mocking exactly, just slightly confused. "Honestly, it's a smart idea," Aunt Beverly said. She was the only person at the table who sounded like she truly believed it. "Rental income is nothing to sneeze at." My mom gave a casual wave of her hand. "Oh, I'm sure it'll work out. Nolan's always been the practical one." She said practical the way people talk about sensible shoes. It was accurate, but there was not a hint of admiration behind it. Preston leaned back in his chair with a beer in his hand and grinned. "Hey man, there's nothing wrong with a starter investment. You'll move up eventually." I just nodded and kept eating my turkey. I did not mention that after collecting rent, my mortgage only cost me $340 a month, while Preston's house seemed to be paid for whenever my parents decided to step in. That was something I figured was better left unsaid. The interesting part about that duplex started during closing. While going through all the paperwork, I pulled the full tax records and sales history for the property. I do that with everything. It is just a habit from the way my brain works. The building had been sold 3 different times over the previous 15 years. Every owner had made money on it. Not the kind of money that changes your life overnight. Just steady, predictable, reliable profit. The rental income consistently covered the mortgage with money left over. Property values kept climbing, rents slowly increased, and the expenses stayed reasonable because it was such a simple building. There was no homeowners association, no swimming pool, and no expensive extras to worry about. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a spreadsheet I had built. That was when something clicked. Not emotionally, mathematically. I started running projections, asking myself what would happen if I bought another property, then another, and kept repeating the process. I looked 5 years ahead, then 10. That spreadsheet completely changed the way I looked at money. More importantly, it changed how I viewed what my parents had actually done for Preston compared to what they believed they had done. I will come back to that. After Thanksgiving, my evenings looked very different. Instead of sitting in front of the television or going out, I spent my time learning. Not motivational books or self-help nonsense. Real books about real estate investing, rental property analysis, tax strategies, cash-on-cash returns, capitalization rates, and everything else I could get my hands on. Sitting at my kitchen table with a laptop and a $12 book from Amazon, I taught myself how experienced investors evaluated deals. That duplex became my classroom. Every month when the rent checks came in, I recorded the income. Every repair got logged too. A broken garbage disposal, a toilet that would not stop running. Every dollar that came in or went out was tracked. After 6 months, the numbers told a very simple story. The duplex was not just paying for itself. It was making money. Not enough to change my life overnight, but enough to make me ask one question. What happens if I do this again? That question ended up shaping the next 10 years of my life. Meanwhile, Preston started running into problems with his house. Nothing catastrophic. Just the normal headaches that come with owning a home when you have not planned for maintenance. Within the first year, part of the roof needed repairs. The backyard had a drainage problem that left standing water every time it rained hard. The heating and air conditioning system was older than either of us, and Preston described the sound it made as some weird clunking whistle. He did not have much in savings. He had never really needed any. Since my parents had bought the house outright, he had no mortgage payment. His regular expenses were just utilities, insurance, and property taxes. On paper, that sounds manageable. The problem was that Preston had built his lifestyle around never having a mortgage. He bought a new car. He ate out 4 nights a week. He took weekend trips whenever he felt like it. He spent money like someone who had won a prize. In his mind, maybe he had. When the estimate to repair the roof came back at $8,500, he called my dad. My dad called my mom. Then my mom called Preston back and told him they would take care of it. That became the routine. Whenever Preston ran into a financial problem, my parents quietly wrote another check. I only knew because Aunt Beverly mentioned it at Easter. She was not trying to gossip. She was simply the kind of person who said whatever was on her mind and believed the truth was nothing to be embarrassed about. We were standing in the kitchen while she covered a casserole dish with aluminum foil when she looked at me and said, "Your dad told me they've already put another $10,000 into that house since Christmas, between the roof and some plumbing issue." I nodded. Sounds about right. She gave me a sideways look. "Doesn't that bother you?" "It's their money," I replied. And technically, that was true, but not completely. A few months later, I found out something that changed the way I looked at everything. When I was 21, I had asked my dad about the college fund my grandfather had set up for Preston and me when we were kids. Grandpa passed away when I was 16, but I still remembered him mentioning during one of my birthday dinners that he had created an education fund for both of his grandsons. Back then, my dad told me the money had mostly been used to pay for our college. Preston went to a state university for 4 years. I went to a different state university for 4 years. At the time, that explanation made perfect sense. What I did not know until Aunt Beverly told me was what happened to the money that was left over. We were standing in that same kitchen, and while she was wrapping a casserole dish in aluminum foil, she said it so casually that it almost sounded like old news. "You know your dad used the rest of that education fund to help pay for Preston's house, right?" I slowly put my drink down. "What?" "The account your grandpa started. After you boys finished college, there was still around $40,000 left in it. Your dad cashed it out and put the money toward Preston's house. He mentioned it to me last year while he was complaining about how expensive that house had become." For several seconds, I could not find a single word to say. "Nolan, are you okay?" "Yeah," I finally answered. "I'm fine." Then I cleared my throat. I just didn't know that. $40,000. Money that had been set aside for both of us. Every dollar of it ended up going toward Preston's house. Nobody asked what I thought. Nobody even mentioned it to me. Nobody pretended it was something we should discuss together. I want to make one thing clear. I did not lose my temper. I did not pound my fist on the counter. I did not start planning some elaborate revenge. That night, I drove home, parked outside my duplex, and sat in my car for almost 20 minutes without moving. I just thought. Then I went inside, opened the spreadsheet I had been working on, and made one decision that would shape the rest of my life. From that point on, I stopped factoring my family into my financial future. Whether they wanted to help me or ignore me no longer mattered. I was not going to confront them. I was not going to ask for my share of the money. Instead, I was going to quietly build my own future. And I promised myself I would never again need their approval or their money. 2 weeks later, I bought my second property. It was another duplex, located in a slightly rougher neighborhood, but rental demand there was strong. The asking price was $165,000. Both units already had tenants. Together, they brought in $1,750 in rent every month. I ran the numbers over and over again. 9 different scenarios. Every one of them worked. By then, my first duplex had gained enough equity that I could open a home equity line of credit to cover the down payment without touching my savings. I called the listing agent on a Tuesday. I submitted my offer by Thursday. The sellers accepted it on Saturday. Nobody in my family had any idea. The next family gathering was at my parents' house on the 4th of July. Preston spent most of the afternoon telling everyone about a sales award he had just received. He had been named Regional Sales Leader for the second quarter. My mom had printed a picture of him holding the plaque and stuck it to the refrigerator with a sunflower-shaped magnet. Every time someone walked into the kitchen, she pointed at it. "Have you seen Preston's award? He beat everyone else in the region." Dad stood outside grilling steaks while talking about how proud he was of both of his sons. Even though he said both, he was looking directly at Preston. My mom even brought out a cake from the grocery store with blue icing that read, "Congratulations, Preston." For a second, I caught myself wondering what I would have to accomplish before someone bought me a cake. Maybe solve climate change. Honestly, maybe not even that. Later, Preston found me standing on the back porch away from everyone else. He opened a beer, leaned against the railing, and smiled. "So, how's the little duplex empire coming along?" "Still just one," I said. He had no idea I already owned a second property. "Same as always. Rent comes in on time. Every now and then a faucet starts dripping." He laughed. "Living the dream, huh?" Then he became a little more serious. "I'll give you credit, though. I couldn't deal with tenants calling me at midnight because a toilet stopped working." "They usually send emails," I replied. "It really isn't that bad." He shrugged and took another drink. "Different strokes. I like owning my own place without all that extra hassle." I never pointed out that the place he called his own had been paid for with someone else's money. Part of it had even come from money that was supposed to belong to both of us. I simply smiled and finished my hot dog. While I was doing my due diligence on that second duplex, I came across something interesting. The previous owner had held the property through a small limited liability company. That same limited liability company also owned a third property that had never even been listed for sale. The company itself had already been dissolved, but the idea stuck with me. I started reading everything I could about holding rental properties inside limited liability companies. Liability protection, tax advantages, cleaner bookkeeping, better separation between personal and business assets. That same evening, I called a guy I had known since college. His name was Gavin. He was now a certified public accountant. One question I asked him that night ended up changing the direction of my entire financial life. But that conversation deserves its own chapter. Gavin and I had lived in the same dorm during our freshman year. We were the kind of friends who survived 9 months of terrible dining hall food together, and, after graduation, stayed in touch through the occasional text message and birthday wishes on social media. He became an accountant, earned his certified public accountant license, and built a career working with small business owners. When I called him, the first thing I said was, "I want to understand the best way to hold rental properties through a limited liability company." Gavin laughed. "Finally," he said, "someone's asking me something interesting." He explained the basics. Set up a limited liability company, transfer the properties into it, keep my personal and business finances separate, open a business bank account, track every expense, pay myself a reasonable management fee. Then he said something that caught my attention. "Use depreciation on the buildings to offset your rental income on paper. It'll lower your taxes." "By how much?" I asked. He smiled. "Enough to make you wish you'd done it a year ago." He was right. Within a month, I formed the limited liability company, transferred both duplexes into it, opened a business checking account, and started treating everything like a real business instead of a side investment. The biggest change wasn't financial, it was mental. I stopped thinking of myself as a guy who owned a couple of rentals and started thinking like someone building a company. 3 years after buying my first duplex, I was 30 and owned 3 properties. The third was a fourplex. Older building, needed some work, but the price was a steal. The owner wanted a quick sale, so I bought it for $240,000. I used equity from my first 2 properties for the 20% down payment, and all 4 units were rented within 6 weeks. My total rental income was now just over $5,800 a month. I still drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic. I wore the same clothes I'd had for years, packed leftovers for lunch, and made coffee at home. Nobody looking at me would have guessed I owned over $500,000 in real estate. That was also when I met Claire. She worked in healthcare administration, and we met through a mutual friend at a barbecue. "You two should talk," our friend said. "You're both weirdly organized." On our third date, I mentioned that I owned 3 rental properties through a limited liability company. She put down her fork. "Wait, how many?" "3 buildings, 7 units." She stared at me. "You drive a Civic." "It runs fine." "Nolan, you own 7 rental units and drive a 2015 Civic?" She laughed. Not at me, at how wrong her first impression had been. "You're the most stealth-wealthy person I've ever met." "I'm not wealthy," I said. "I'm just not broke." Claire became the only person who knew the whole picture. Not my parents. Not Preston. Not even my friends. She understood what I was building, and she understood why I kept quiet. One night she said, "If you tell your family, they'll either want something from you or find a way to make it about Preston. Just keep doing what you're doing." She was right. About 6 months later, my parents came to visit. Mom walked through my half of the duplex, touching everything. "This is cozy," she said in the kitchen. "Very efficient use of space," she said in the living room. She didn't say anything about my home office. At dinner, Dad asked about work. I told him I'd gotten a raise. He nodded. Mom asked if I was still doing the rental thing. I said yes, as long as it isn't too stressful. Then she spent the next 20 minutes talking about Preston's new backyard patio, which he'd financed, and the housewarming party he was planning. Claire looked at me from across the table. One look said everything. I looked back. I knew. About 2 months later, Preston called me on a Wednesday night. He sounded uncomfortable from the start. Too much small talk. Too many anyway comments. Finally, he got to the point. "Look, I'm in a bit of a cash flow situation. The patio cost more than I expected, and I got hit with a tax bill. I was wondering if you could loan me $15,000. I'll pay you back in 6 months. Maybe sooner." $15,000. I let the silence hang for a second. "That's a big ask, Preston." "I know," he said, "but I'm kind of stuck." After a pause, Preston added, "Mom and Dad have already helped me a lot, and I really don't want to ask them again." Right away, I thought about the college fund, the $40,000 that disappeared without anyone saying a word, the framed photo on the mantel, the cute little landlord joke. All of it came rushing back. "I can't do that," I said. "I'm not in a position to lend out that kind of money." That wasn't completely true. I had the money. But lending it to Preston felt like pouring water into a bucket with a hole in the bottom. I'd spent the last 3 years being careful with every dollar I earned. He went quiet. Then he said, "All right, no worries." But it definitely wasn't no worries. Less than a week later, my mom called. She didn't ask how I was doing. She got straight to the point. "Preston told me you turned him down. He's your brother, Nolan. He needed help." I said I wasn't in a position to lend that much. "You have tenants paying you rent every month. Don't tell me you don't have it." "Having the money and being willing to lend it are 2 different things, Mom." She let out a long sigh. "Your brother would have done it for you." I almost said something I'd regret. Instead, I simply replied, "I hope he figures it out." Then I hung up. What nobody in my family knew was that Preston's problems went far beyond a patio and a tax bill. I'd been paying attention. Between public records, things Aunt Beverly casually mentioned, and comments Preston made without thinking, the picture was much worse than anyone wanted to admit. Nobody asked what I thought, so I kept it to myself. The next few years were pretty simple. I just kept repeating the same process. Buy a property, fix it up, rent it out, repeat. It sounds boring, and honestly, it was. But boring builds wealth in ways excitement never does. 7 years after buying my first duplex, I was 34. I owned 6 properties with 15 rental units, all under my limited liability company, and every one of them was cash flow positive. On paper, my net worth had grown to a little over $1,400,000. After expenses and mortgage payments, the rentals were bringing in about $7,200 a month. Claire and I had gotten married the year before. We kept it simple. Small wedding, no drama. We spent our honeymoon in Portugal and paid for the whole trip in cash. My family had no idea. I never gave them a reason to. I still lived in the original duplex. I still drove my Civic, which now had 140,000 miles on it, and a dashboard rattle I'd almost grown attached to. Claire and I updated the inside with new countertops and appliances, but from the street, it looked exactly the same. Meanwhile, Preston was heading in the opposite direction. 2 years after getting the house, he refinanced it. My parents had given it to him completely paid off. The first thing he did was borrow $180,000 against it. He remodeled the kitchen, finished the basement, and bought a boat. Yes, really. It was a 22-foot bayliner that sat in a marina 45 minutes from his house. He used it maybe 6 times. Now he had a mortgage payment on a house that had originally been free. Between that, his car loan, credit cards, and expensive lifestyle, he was drowning. But online, everything looked perfect. New clothes, nice restaurants, weekend trips. If you followed him on social media, you'd think he was living his best life. In reality, he was falling apart financially. I knew because Aunt Beverly knew, and Aunt Beverly couldn't keep a secret for more than 3 days. That Christmas, she told me Preston had already missed 2 mortgage payments. My parents quietly covered both of them. Then she told me something even worse. My dad had co-signed the refinance. If Preston stopped paying, my parents would be responsible for the loan. Your dad can't afford that, Aunt Beverly said, shaking her head. He's already taken money out of his retirement twice. She lowered her voice. Your mom doesn't even know about the second time. I just stood there holding a plate of cookies, doing the math in my head. By then, my parents were in their early 60s. Dad was still working, but he'd been talking about retirement for years. Buying Preston that house was supposed to be the big family legacy. Instead, it had turned into a financial hole that was pulling them down with it. Then, around February, my dad called me. Not my mom. My dad. That alone told me something was wrong because he almost never called. He usually just sent texts. Nolan, he said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out. Okay. Your mother and I are thinking about selling our house. My mom and I are thinking about selling the house, Dad said. Maybe downsizing to a condo. We're a little stretched financially, and I was hoping you could give me some advice. He wasn't asking me for money. He was asking for guidance. In the 10 years since my parents had laughed at my duplex, it was the first time my dad spoke to me like I actually knew something he didn't. I could hear it in his voice. The pauses, the hesitation, the pride he had to swallow just to make the call. So I gave him real advice. I told him to get a market analysis on the house. I told him to meet with an independent fee-only financial advisor, not someone trying to sell him products. I told him to figure out what he and Mom actually needed instead of what they were used to. I explained that the condo market was strong and that downsizing could free up cash and make retirement easier. I was patient. I was specific. I never mentioned the college fund. I never brought up all the years I'd been overlooked. I just helped. He thanked me. Then he quietly said, Don't tell your mother. She's not ready to have this conversation. I won't, Dad. In the end, he ignored every bit of my advice. That summer, we had a family barbecue at Preston's house. Kind of ironic. considering that house had become a monument to bad financial decisions. The patio he'd financed was already cracking. The boat sat under a tarp with a flat trailer tire. The finished basement had a strange smell that Preston blamed on humidity. Preston was louder than usual, acting like everything was fine. He walked around with barbecue tongs like he owned a restaurant, flipping burgers nobody asked for and telling jokes that barely landed. At one point, we were standing around the fire pit when he looked at me and said, "So, Nolan's still playing landlord with that little duplex?" The duplex. Singular. As far as he knew, I still owned one building with 2 units. He had no idea I owned 6 properties, 15 rental units, and had quietly bought a beach house 4 months earlier. "Yep," I said. "Still at it." "Respect," he replied. The tone said the exact opposite. Mom smiled from her lawn chair. Nolan's always been the practical one. There was that word again. Practical. On the drive home, Claire looked over at me. "How do you stay quiet? How do you just let them think that?" "Because it doesn't matter what they think," I said. "It matters what's true." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "What's true is you own a beach house, and Preston's boat has a flat tire." I laughed. It was the hardest I'd laughed in a long time. 2 weeks later, the first domino fell. Preston received a certified letter from his lender. He was 90 days behind on his mortgage. Foreclosure proceedings had started. The house my parents bought for him. The house he refinanced. The loan my dad had co-signed. Preston called my parents. My parents called each other. Mom called Aunt Beverly. Aunt Beverly called me. "It's happening," she said. "Preston's losing the house." I sat on the back porch of my old duplex, watched the sun go down, and quietly said, "Yeah, I figured." The next morning, at 7:15, my phone rang. It was Preston. I looked at the screen for a few seconds before answering. "Nolan." Then he said something I'd never heard from him before. "I need help." Not, "Can you loan me money?" Not, "Can you talk to Mom and Dad?" Just 3 words, and they sounded like they had been dragged out of him. I sat on the edge of my bed. Claire looked up from her book. I held up one finger. "Okay," I said. "Tell me what's going on." And for the first time in our adult lives, Preston stopped performing. No fake confidence, no pretending everything was fine. He told me everything. The refinance, the credit card debt, the missed payments, the foreclosure notice, the boat he still owed $14,000 on even though he hadn't used it in 2 years. He admitted Mom and Dad had bailed him out 3 different times. He admitted Dad had co-signed the refinance, meaning a foreclosure would destroy Dad's credit and could leave him responsible for the remaining debt. "I didn't think it would get this bad," Preston said. His voice cracked, not dramatically, just from exhaustion. I let him finish. Then I asked, "What do you want from me, Preston?" "I don't want money," he said quickly. "I can't ask you for money again." He took a breath. "I want to know how you did it. The duplex. You've owned that place for 10 years, and you've never seemed stressed about money." For a second, I just stared ahead. I'd imagined that conversation 100 different times. I just never thought it would actually happen. Now that the moment had finally come, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt tired. "It's not that complicated," I told him. "I bought a property that made me money every month instead of costing me money. Then I bought another. Then another. I kept my expenses low and reinvested everything." "How many do you own?" I paused. 6 buildings, 15 units. Silence. 15 units? He repeated. "Yeah." "What the heck, Nolan? You never asked." He let out a short laugh. "I thought you still had that one duplex." "I know." "Does Mom know?" "No, nobody does. Just Claire." Another long silence. Then he quietly said, "I really messed this up." "You spent money you didn't have on things you didn't need," I replied. "That's fixable. But first, you have to be honest about where you are." For the next hour, I walked him through his options. Sell the house before the foreclosure. Take the loss and protect Dad's credit. Sell the boat. Pay off the credit cards. rent an apartment for a while and learn to live below his means. There was nothing revolutionary about it. It was just math. Preston had never lacked intelligence. He'd just never been forced to deal with the consequences of his choices. This time, he listened. He didn't argue. When we finished, he simply said, "Thanks, Nolan." And for the first time, it sounded sincere. Over the next 2 months, everything happened quickly. Preston put the house up for sale. It sold for $285,000, about $35,000 less than my parents had paid for it. After paying off the loan, he walked away with almost nothing, but he walked away without a foreclosure. Dad was no longer responsible for the debt. Preston sold the boat for $9,000 less than he owed and used his annual bonus to cover the difference. Then he moved into a one-bedroom apartment near work. It wasn't glamorous, but for the first time in years, he was financially stable. My parents struggled with all of it. After the house sold, Mom called me. She wasn't angry at Preston. She was angry at the situation. "This was supposed to be his foundation," she said. "We gave him everything he needed. How did this happen?" I thought about my answer. "You gave him a house, Mom. You didn't teach him how to keep it." She went quiet. "That's a cruel thing to say." "No," I said. "It's just the truth." A moment later, she changed the subject to Thanksgiving. I let her. The truth about the beach house came out by accident. A few months later, Claire and I invited everyone over to our duplex for a simple family cookout. Just burgers, salad, and a relaxed evening. Toward the end of dinner, Claire came back from the kitchen after taking a phone call. "The handyman can fix the deck railing at the beach house on Thursday," she said. "Should I drive down or wait until the weekend?" She said it like it was nothing. The whole table froze. Mom slowly put down her drink. "What beach house?" I looked at Claire. She looked back at me with an expression that said, "Oops." "We bought a place on the coast last year," I said. "A beach house?" Mom asked again. Preston leaned forward. "How can you afford a beach house?" I smiled. "That's not even my favorite one." Nobody spoke. For about 5 full seconds. Then Aunt Beverly burst out laughing. "I told you," she said. "I told all of you." Dad looked at me differently than he ever had before. Not exactly with pride. More like he was trying to figure out how he'd completely missed what I'd been building all those years. Mom opened her mouth, stopped, then finally asked, "Why didn't you tell us?" I gave her the only honest answer I had. "You never asked." I wasn't trying to make a point. It wasn't meant to be dramatic. It was simply true. In 10 years, nobody in my family had ever asked about my goals, my finances, or what I was building. They assumed they already knew. They thought practical meant thinking small. And somewhere around my second year of investing, I stopped needing them to see me differently. These days, Preston and I actually talk more than we used to. Not constantly, but more. He's still living in his apartment. He started flipping furniture on the side. It's nothing huge yet, but he's finally learning what it means to buy low, add value, and earn the result himself. Last month, Preston texted me a picture of a dresser he'd refinished and asked what he should charge for it. I gave him a number. He sold it for exactly that price. Then he sent me one message. "Nice. These days, my parents and I get along fine. We still have Sunday dinners once in a while. Mom still talks about Preston more than she talks about me, but it feels different now. There's less bragging and more concern. She has never apologized for the college fund or for the way she treated us differently. Honestly, I don't think she ever will. But she did stop calling me practical. Last month, I overheard her telling one of her friends, "Nolan is really sharp with money." Coming from her, that's probably the closest thing I'll ever get to an apology. Dad finally retired. He and Mom sold their old house and moved into a smaller ranch. Before they bought it, he called me for advice. This time, he actually listened. They found a good house in a quiet neighborhood at a fair price. He seems happier now. We never really talk about the past. Claire and I moved out of the original duplex last year. Now we live full-time in one of our other properties, a 3-bedroom house I bought in rough shape and spent 8 months renovating. The duplex is fully rented, Both units are still cash flow positive. It's still boring. And it's still my favorite investment. The beach house is great. The view is amazing. But if I'm honest, I'm not proudest of any single property. I'm proud that I built everything from an idea everyone dismissed. One duplex, one spreadsheet, one quiet decision to bet on myself when nobody else thought I was worth noticing.